MEOPAR, exactEarth, and Clear Seas are pleased to present this webinar introducing our new community of practice, the Canadian Marine Shipping Risk Forum. I'd now like to introduce Ron Pillow, the Associate Scientific Director of MEOPAR and one of the leads for the shipping community of practice. Ron, over to you.
Hello, everybody. I'm going to first talk briefly about what is a community of practice, although many of you may be familiar with that, maybe not everybody is. So the purpose of a community of practice in general is for research especially, is to help mobilize knowledge and encourage collaboration between people. And that would help us see what are hot topics, what are gaps in the research, keep abreast more quickly of developments in industry and in academia, and also to be able to convert recent findings or developments better into policy or deliver it to practitioners. It's also a way for non-researchers to connect on the topic, whether it's cross-industry or government, and think about best practices. So the MEOPAR Centers of Excellence, that I'll talk about a little bit more later, is one of the supporters of this community of practice. And we also find it's a good mechanism to focus on certain topics in the country which are not well covered through other media or conferences. And so we're actually supporting 9 communities of practice, which you can check out through our website. For our own community of practice called the Canadian Marine Shipping Risk Forum, the scope of the work is to think about shipping from the point of view largely of modeling. And that goes everywhere from thinking of where does the data come from on shipping movements, which is AIS, automatic identification system from satellites, and or from land-based receivers, but also data from other sources such as vessel traffic services sometimes, or the fishing traffic modeling. So different ways to get data. And once you have data on the ships, then you can obviously do tracking of what are their movements, so you can understand patterns and trends. You can look at density issues, and you can start to think about risks. And we think of risks kind of to shipping, like the effects of weather on shipping, or the effects of ice on shipping, or things that maybe are good for navigation. And of course, shipping can cause disturbances such as pollution or interference with northern communities and things like that. So it can be from oil spills to accidents at sea to air emissions. So all kinds of risks that are caused by shipping. And our community of practice can cover any of those kinds of topics. Now, the purpose of that, again, reiterating what the general COP purposes are to think about what are best practices in the area of ship modeling and risk analysis, and to keep abreast more quickly of what are developments and priorities in this area by industry and by government. And then researchers can maybe engage with some of those topics. And then also perhaps develop some new areas of interest, given that it's a very cross-sector and cross-disciplinary group. I also want to point out now that this is the first official webinar that this COP is having, although we have had some informal meetings, regional meetings in the past, organized with exactEarth and Clear Seas. And upcoming, as you see on the screen, is our first official workshop, which will be on December 2nd in Halifax. ArcticNet is having their scientific meeting in Halifax from the 3rd to the 5th, and we are deliberately starting the day before because there will be people at ArcticNet that would want to come to our shipping forum. We're working on the agenda now, and as you'll see through the talk today, we're looking for topics for the agenda, so feel free to contact us through this webinar or directly with suggestions for what we cover during that day. It's free to attend. If you're at ArcticNet, you can participate in this workshop for free, and otherwise we're covering the cost of the the meals. So don't let the cost scare you off. If you're interested in attending, we'd really like to have a broad sector of people attending this thing. And we'll have a few presentations, but it's not a traditional academic conference. We also want time for roundtables and breakout discussions on various groups, and also suggestions for future activities for the COP. So now I'd like to introduce the speakers today. There will be three presenters. Peter Dorcas from exactEarth and Megan Matheson from ClearSeas are co-leaders of this COP, along with me from MEOPAR, and we'll each speak for about 10 minutes. And we'll interleave that with a couple of short surveys, which will help guide our planning for the workshop. And then we'll follow up with the question period, as Laura said. So Peter Dorcas is the Vice President of Business Development at exactEarth Limited, based in Southern Ontario. And he has 18 years of experience supporting the introduction of new space-based products and services to the international market. Peter joined exactEarth 10 years ago as a Director of Sales and Marketing. And prior to joining exactEarth, he held systems engineering, project management, business development positions at ComDev and McDonald Detweiler. Megan Matheson is the research manager at ClearSeas Center for Responsible Marine Shipping, based on the West Coast. And as a research manager for the last 3 years, she's worked on many issues related to shipping, commercial shipping, such as vessel traffic patterns, drift rates, emergency towing, air emissions, and alternative marine fuels. And I'll be the last speaker. And aside from being the Associate Scientific Director of MEOPAR, I'm also, as I said, one of the leaders of the shipping community of practice. I'm also Professor of Industrial Engineering at Dalhousie, and for over 20 years, we've been developing software tools and methods to simulate maritime traffic and do various types of risk analysis associated with weather factors, ice, remoteness in the north, and also concentrating a bit on search and rescue planning and marine oil spills. So I'll pass it over to Peter now, who will begin his talk.
Thank you, Ron. It's Peter Dorcas here, and thank you to all the attendees for spending your time here today to attend the webinar. Just one moment as I share my slides and bring those up. Okay, share. So if the group could let me know if those slides are properly appearing.
Yes, that's fine, Peter.
Okay, great. And so thank you very much. As Ron said, exactEarth is really pleased to be part of the community of practice and to support marine research. And we believe that our data set can greatly support the activities of the community. And so with that, I'll just provide a brief introduction of some of the advancements in satellite technology that enable very vast data sets to be collected and then used by the research community to help inform policy and other uses to determine shipping risks. So if we go to the next slide here, I'm just advancing my slide. Okay, so exactEarth is a Canadian-based services company. We're based in Cambridge, Ontario, Canada. We pioneered satellite AIS market, so the automatic identification system was mandated by the IMO to install ship beacons that transmit their course, heading, and speed. Primarily, its purpose is for ship safety. To prevent collisions. And so back in 2005, we did quite a bit of research to prove that we could pick up those same signals from space, and we believed if we did so, we would have a global data set that would have both commercial value and value to a number of customers. So we introduced a service back in 2010. We've been a longstanding member of MEOPAR as an industrial partner dating back to 2014, and we've supported an extensive amount of Canadian maritime research using our data set. So what do we actually provide? We provide global ship tracking data, which is the AIS information that I'll talk about a little bit further as we get into the presentation. And that's provided in large historical archive data sets. It's of interest mostly to the research community that look at trends and behaviors in that. And we also offer live data feeds that are streaming feeds that can go into systems that analyze the data in real time and create alerts. So not only can you look at it from a historical perspective, but you can have a live data feed that can be used to alert and trigger events for monitoring or compliance. We have over 100 government agencies around the world in 40 plus countries that have adopted this service. It's a new service, and it's being used also in the commercial markets for financial services, for ship brokering, for fleet operations and optimizations. And we are a public company traded on the Toronto Stock Exchange. Talking a little bit about the system, we started our system, which was based on a microsatellite constellation. And over the years, since our partnerships with MEOPAR, we've moved towards a second generation system with hosted payloads and the Iridium satellites. So what you're seeing here in the top right, hopefully you're seeing these animations of the satellite footprints orbiting the Earth in very defined planes. And we've now moved to a system where we have persistent coverage of the world. There's always a satellite overhead, if not one or two. You can see the overlapping footprints. And those are collecting the AIS transmissions from ships. And that's being relayed in real time through the Iridium network, down through a ground station and out to our customers. We're seeing global average latencies, and some messages are coming through in under 7 seconds from the time they're transmitted from a ship anywhere in the ocean and out on our feed. So it's a very extensive network that's now been deployed in collaboration with the Harris Corporation that's built the hosted payload that sits on the Iridium network. The Iridium network, as you might know, is a real-time telephony system. It's a $3 billion real-time network. And we're taking advantage of that network in that when we collect the information, it's being relayed through the satellite-to-satellite links and then down through the ground in a very performant way. And so that offers a number of unique capabilities and true global coverage. The system has been designed for 15+ year life. And we're just starting really the tip of the iceberg on exploiting this new comprehensive data set. So what does that look like? So when you look at the data itself, you can see the extensive trends. This is showing 1 month of shipping data. You can see the shipping lanes, fishing activity, and different activities happening around the world. This is looking at all vessels. You could subset that data set by their AIS transmissions. So the next slide is showing fishing. So you can see the fishing activity is a very different pattern. Container ships tend to go from port to port in a very efficient way. Fishing vessels have quite a different pattern of behavior, as you can see here with the different fishing activity zones. You can also look at tanker traffic, again, much like the cargo ships, they're going point to point, although you do see some in the mid-Pacific here that are showing zigzag lines. And those are kind of interesting tankers because they're actually servicing the fishing fleet and refueling them at sea. So there's quite a bit of interesting information you can see just by looking at the pattern of analysis of the traffic itself. So if we talk about AIS, I think I've briefly mentioned that it is called the Automatic Identification System, and it was deployed for the safety of life at sea, for ships to send out the course, heading, and speed so that they don't run into each other. And the novel approach that we've taken here is to launch satellites that listen to that data and then collect it and deliver it to customers. So talking a little bit about the data set itself, it is a fairly rich data set. It's not just simply a timestamp and a position. There's quite a bit of information contained in the data set that can be used by the community to model ship behavior and trends. So we have the MMSI number, which is the primary AIS transmission identifier. The ship captain also enters in the ship name, the ship's call sign, which would also be painted on the side of the hull, its position, as I mentioned, but also its IMO number, the ship type, the country of the vessel, and its dynamic information. So this can get interesting. You have the ship's speed, you can have its draft, its course over ground, its rate of turn, and some static information about the vessel, being its width and length. The captain also can program in its destination. Usually do the from to port combination. So they'll say the port that they left and the port that they're destined to with your estimated time of arrival. So it's quite a rich data set that can be used. And so just to remind people that there is a lot more information than just a timestamp and a position hit. And so what is the data used for? I'm showing here a ship modeling in correlation with other sensor data. So the density plot is shown here, and you can see a historic density of ship activity and then overlaid with the current ship track. And so you can model the ship's behavior, and with the density plot, you can also help inform potentially its ship route, and you can model where it's going and what route it might take based on past behavior of vessels on similar transits. And you can also use that information to tip and cue with other sensors. So in this example, we're showing a synthetic aperture radar capture of a vessel. You can see its chiplet in the right description there from a radar satellite. It can also help detect its and calculate its length and width and correlate it. And so you can fuse it with other information to correlate its position. In terms of modeling and risks assessment, the data is very vast. It's been used on a significant number of different research projects, as you're going to hear from both Megan and Ron in their presentations. I like to highlight that there are a number of uses, and it all depends on your use case, but it can be used for looking at environmental impacts, looking at the shipping impacts, increased shipping impacts on both noise pollution and ballast water exchange. So you can also use the data to more efficiently optimize trade routes and logistics, so you're burning less fuel and less emissions if you have better information. It's also being used for marine protected areas and helping define marine protected areas and sensitive areas to be protected, so they can look at the ship traffic in certain regions and decide that that's increasing at a certain rate and they will need to potentially put in a marine protected area. And then also on the enforcement side, they can be used for identification of violators as they transit those regions. So with that, I think the rest of the presentations will talk more extensively about the use cases, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. If you would like more information, of course, I'd encourage you to visit the exactEarth website. We have quite a few both blog posts, web posts, and videos of our data, as well as some of our own webinars. If there's any interest, you could also follow up with me directly. And so with that, I'd turn it over to Megan, and thank you for your attention.
Hello, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm just bringing my screen up, and my objective today is just to provide an overview of some of ClearSea's ongoing research efforts, that we are attempting to provide a better understanding of the marine environment in Canada through our Marine Transportation Corridors Initiative. And it's intended to support marine spatial planning efforts by providing information on where different types of ships travel, the rate of drift if a vessel were to be disabled, what types of emergency assets are needed to respond, and the sensitivities of various coastal environments to ship source risks, one of which could be oil spills. So just a little bit about ClearSeas. We are an independent not-for-profit research center launched in 2015, and we're focused on supporting safer and more sustainable commercial marine shipping in Canada across all three coasts, as well as the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence Seaway. Our research is produced to support evidence-based decision-making and has been applied in many different contexts, such as the Canadian Coast Guard's Emergency Towing Needs Assessment and the Council of Haida Nations' efforts to establish a safe distance offshore from Haida Gwaii in concert with Transport Canada. Our intent is to facilitate a better understanding of the risks and benefits of commercial marine shipping in Canada and bring clarity to decision-making. All of our research is available on our website and also through our newsletter and social media channels. So to move into the Marine Transportation Corridors Initiative, this is a number of different efforts that are all intended to layer together to provide a better picture of what's going on out there on the coast. So this initiative is currently focused on the Pacific region. However, our intent is to develop the methodology, test it out in the Pacific, and then apply it to the Atlantic and the Arctic regions to be able to provide the same picture in different areas. So the project has 5 focus areas to identify priorities and the associated mitigation measures. The first 3 geospatial deliverables are vessel drift and response analysis, which is complete, the vessel traffic analysis, which is just about complete, and sensitive coastal areas, which is also underway. We have combined those. The intention is to layer them together, and I'll show some maps in a moment to create heat maps and identify priority areas where perhaps additional attention is needed or where higher risks might be present. And then the 2 capacity assessments, emergency towing vessel needs and availability of tugs of opportunity, are to give us an understanding of what kind of capabilities an emergency towing vessel or ETV would need to respond to a range of drifting ships and the capacity of the Tug of Opportunity System as it exists today. This initiative relies on an AIS data set from 2014 to 2016 for the Pacific Coast, which we acquired from exactEarth. And finally, for this initiative, we intend to hold a workshop that would wrap everything up and bring together a range of participants to review and discuss the findings and what the potential next steps are. So just to show a couple of deliverables associated with this work, on the left is the vessel drift and response showing where the different layers of pink are to show where a ship could be traveling, and if it were to drift, what is the likelihood a response asset would be able to get there in time to stop the ship before it drifted aground. The center map shows, very similar to what Peter just showed, vessel traffic patterns along the Pacific coast. And then the one on the far right is sensitive coastal areas, and that's layering together different data sets to show areas that could be more vulnerable or more sensitive to ship impacts. So to touch on the vessel drift and response analysis in a little bit more depth, the objectives are up on the screen. And with this particular study, the analysis does not address the probability of a ship suffering a breakdown or accident. And we also do recognize that such breakdowns are relatively infrequent events, but it does happen. And when a ship is drifting, our coast is at risk. So this study applied NUCA Research's zone of no save methodology to estimate the amount of time that would be available to respond to a drifting ship, and then modeled various scenarios to identify what risk reductions were achievable through the strategic positioning and deployment of rescue assets. So this map shows the results of 3 of those scenarios that we ran. We did 7 in total. So scenario 1 looks at, and that's the red line on the screen, that shows the state of the world at the time we did this study, which was 1 emergency towing vessel stationed at Neal Bay in the US. Scenario 4, the green line, shows the potential of having 2 emergency towing vessels, 1 at Neal Bay and 1 in Prince Rupert. And then scenario 7, the orange line, actually shows more or less what the state of play is today with the Coast Guard, Canadian Coast Guard's 2 leased emergency towing vessels, 1 operating in the northern half of the BC coast and 1 operating kind of in the southern half outside of Vancouver Island. And what these different scenarios show is that the amount of time needed to reach a ship that's drifting changes depending on where your emergency tow assets are stationed and where the ship itself is traveling. Moving on to looking at, okay, so you've got a ship drifting, what do you need to respond to that ship safely? And an effective emergency response requires towing assets with sufficient capabilities to render useful assistance, and it must also be able to arrive on scene in a timely manner, has to get there, successfully attach a tow line, and then have sufficient power to be able to tow the disabled ship to a safe location. So this study describes the characteristics needed to be effective, and we assess 7 different types of ships that are commonly operating off the Pacific coast. And these ship types were selected because they're representative of current and expected future commercial traffic off of the Pacific coast, and also because they tend to have large windage areas. So we were looking at large container ships, LNG carriers, cruise ships, because these types of vessels are more prone to higher drift rates than other ship types such as tankers, which are lower to the water. So this graphic gives a sense of how the bollard pull or capability of an emergency towing vessel will change depending on the type of wind event that we're looking at. So we used historical weather data from Environment Canada and commuter modeling to determine the capabilities required to respond in 5 different weather conditions from 50th to 99th percentile. And so this establishes that the requirements vary significantly with the intensity of weather. And although the right-hand side 99th percentile worst case scenario has a very low likelihood of occurrence, we thought that understanding the full range was important for planning purposes. The other interesting thing that came out of this study was the information that tankers are the only ships that are required by the IMO to have bollard point attachments that are able to sustain an emergency tow. Most other ships have attachment points that are suitable for berthing operations, not necessarily for emergency open ocean conditions. And the results in this study are drawn from traffic that is transiting the Pacific coast, but the conclusions that are drawn here are relevant elsewhere in Canada because similar types of ships encounter comparable wind and wave conditions in the Atlantic region. And we did check the weather data from the Atlantic to be confident and be able to say that. So moving on to the Tug of Opportunity System, which is tugs that are just out there doing their business and operating commercially, towing barges to and fro. would they be able to respond to a ship in distress if there was such a ship needing assistance? And so what we tried to do with this report is demonstrate how often tugs of certain capabilities could be present at any location along the coast. But this study does not assess all the factors that would determine whether any sort of tow attempt would be successful. So this table gives an indication of the different types of ships that were assessed in our previous study, ranging from a large container ship to an Aframax tanker, the weather conditions that we assessed, 50th to 99th percentile, and then the number of tugs available or operating in the Pacific region and their bollard pull capabilities. So you can see as we get into higher and higher wind conditions and larger vessels, there are fewer and fewer tugs available that could potentially be able to respond effectively to a ship in distress. And this map here, these two maps show on the left-hand side the distribution of tugs with bollard pull that's greater than 50 megatons, and on the right-hand side, the distribution of tugs with bollard pull greater than 90 megatons. And as you can see, there are much fewer tugs and they're available much less frequently in any area when you get up to larger, more capable tugs. And the largest tugs are most likely going to be available in the Juan de Fuca Salish Sea area, where there's the most ship traffic, as makes sense. So that is a quick recap of our Marine Transportation Corridors Initiative. And if you have any questions, we would welcome those during the question period. And for now, I think we're going to transition into a quick poll to get a sense of what sort of topics are most of interest to the people gathered here today that we could tackle in our upcoming workshop in December. And if I could get the poll raised up. There we go. So what we're asking for is to take a quick look at the topic areas we've listed here. And we do have an other section. So if you have something else that's not listed here, please do put that into the chat or the questions. And we want to get a sense, and you can choose more than one if you think more than one is of interest to you. So for a potential roundtable discussion session, which one would be of most interest to you? Assessing marine protected areas effectiveness in changing vessel behavior, qualitative versus quantitative risk assessment approaches, the advantages and challenges of using AIS data for risk modeling, incorporating multidisciplinary perspectives into shipping risk assessments, and then, as I mentioned, other. So please feel free to go ahead, click on that, choose your topic. We'll allow a few minutes for that, and then we'll see what the results have to show us. All right, shall we take a look at what the results say? If we had enough time for everybody to put in their input? All right, so it looks like their qualitative versus quantitative risk assessment approaches is leading the way with 60% interest, but the other topics are also showing a fair bit of interest. So this is going to be hard to decide. We'll have to see how we can narrow it down, but thank you very much for providing that feedback. And what I'm going to do now is stop sharing my screen so that Ron can take over, and Ron will be presenting his work next.
Yeah, great. So there are a lot of interesting topics there that we could consider for the workshop, and it's a full day workshop, so it's quite possible we'll be able to cover a lot of these topics. So what I'm going to talk about today is not my work per se, as much as MEOPAR's involvement in this kind of work. So what is MEOPAR? So MEOPAR, many of you know, but not all the people online. Means Marine Environmental Observation, Prediction, and Response Network. And this research funding network was founded in 2012 in light of the fact that the marine environment is changing all the time, of course, but it seems to be changing faster now due to climate change. But also humankind's changing use of the ocean, such as offshore drilling and renewable energy and traffic, which is a focus of our community practice. And since there's a lot of changes, then we could certainly benefit from more research. So the way these networks of centers of excellence work is they're funded by the federal government through the Tri-Council, so they get a lot of funding from NSERC, NSHRC, and Health Research CIHR, who pool their money to support networks of centers of excellence. And there's a headquarters at a given university. So this particular one is headquartered at Dalhousie, and then receive a certain amount of funds to support many types of programs, such as training of grad students, as well as networking events and knowledge mobilization events. But a large part of it is to do research projects that would help to strengthen Canada's capacity to understand, of course, and anticipate and respond to such marine risks. So this gives an idea of our activity levels. We've been into our second cycle now. They're 5-year cycles. So we had $25 million in our first cycle and $28.5 million now. Aside from that, we have a lot of partners, of which ClearSeas and exactEarth are two. But we have a lot of partners that either supply funds and a lot of in-kind and a lot of partnerships on events, a lot of partnership on research. And this gives you an idea of the geographic scope of our projects. As you can see, there's a large number on the East Coast and the West Coast. And although there are more dots on the East Coast, there are actually an equal amount of money going to the West Coast. They just have fewer universities involved in the projects out there. But UBC and UVic are big players, and of course Memorial and Dalhousie and a lot of the other universities. So when this slide was made, we had 27 universities and 64 projects, but that keeps changing. We've had some new projects start and a few that now are finished, even though those researchers are usually still involved with the network. And here's the number of grad students if you want, but this includes postdocs and technicians and undergrad students, as well as almost 500. And network partners means the ones like exactEarth that partner with the entire network to achieve a certain aim. Many of the partners partner with a particular university. Most of our projects must be multidisciplinary, usually science and social science working together, and multi-university and multi-sector. So one of the advantages of a network like MEOPAR is that we require and encourage collaboration so we can get broader outputs. So that gives you an idea of what the MEOPAR network is about, and shipping is one of our topics amongst many topics. So in our cycle one, we had an arrangement with exactEarth Limited whereby they would supply satellite AIS data at a great academic discount, and so we could support up to 10 research projects. And then they also joined with us to support other activities such as these regional workshops I mentioned earlier, as well as our annual scientific meeting. They played a role in supporting that. And so here's a brief synopsis of the projects that we support in cycle one. So this is not a very exciting presentation because with a very short time, I don't have time for all the pictures and the deep explanations. but I am familiar with all these projects, and mostly my point today is to show you the variety of topics that we've undertaken over this time frame. So the first one here, the noise in the marine environment, we've had 3 projects that have looked at shipping noise, and this one was done by Rosalind Canessa out of UVic. Another project was about looking at fishing patterns, an effort using AIS data. So this is Boris Worm and Stan Matwin at Dalhousie University. And the idea is if you have satellite data and you can pick up on ships' movements periodically, you can infer behavior of various ships based on their movement, to the point where certain kinds of fisheries move in certain ways. And so you can start to not only see where fisheries, but perhaps a kind of species they're searching for, and of course illegal fishing if they're in areas or times of year they're not supposed to be. While I'm at it, Stan Matwin is showing up as number 10 on the list. He's a senior researcher in computer science, a lot to do with data analytics, and he's not only key because he does research with the AIS data, but his center at Dalhousie also houses the data that we get from exactEarth for doing the analysis. And Casey Hilliard, who is the assistant for running this community of practice, is also the key programmer working with Stan to prepare the AIS data for analyses. So as you saw from Peter's presentation, the data is very complex, and not only that, they're massive databases. So we don't get the data and hand it out to the researchers at the universities because very few of them would know what to do with it. They don't have the skills or capacity. So part of this whole organizational process is that, you know, they would say which geographic area they need, what time period they need, what resolution they need, what types of ships they need, and then Casey will work with them to extract the kind of data that they need, and sometimes do some analysis on it to supplement their project. So the third one on the list here is Chris Taggart at Dalhousie, and is doing various things with AIS data. Part of it is available for looking at whale collisions. And this listening experiment was also saying where are the ships, and of course using other data sets, where are the whales, and what about their interactions? How close are ships to whales? And also, are there ways to try to detect whales through acoustic devices so that you can anticipate when they might be in the way of your path and slow down or divert your ship? So all this involves a lot of information on shipping patterns. The next one, number 4, was all done out of Université d'Ottawa in Gatineau, and it involves that they also have ship modeling in the St. Lawrence already that look at some of the risks of shipping, but noise wasn't integrated in it, and ship whale collisions weren't integrated into it. So they did some research using the AIS data to figure out how to get a multi-risk assessment of ships going up and down the St. Lawrence, which was very interesting. The fifth one on this list is looking at coastal community resilience, and there's another ongoing MEOPAR projects on that, looking at different parts of it. And this part was that if you have a transportation disruption in shipping on the West Coast, how are you going to move fuels around if the regular fuel deliveries are impeded or stopped? Can you use other vessels? Can you go to different locations, or what are those paths and how vulnerable are they? So you can see so far there's quite a variety of topics already, and I'm only halfway through the list. The next one by Aldona Wycheck from St. Mary's University is looking at emissions from ships, air emissions, and you can use that then in combination with land-based sensors to model the pollution levels and try to also figure out how much of that is coming from shipping traffic. Shipping traffic actually contributes noticeable amount of pollution around the world in terms of greenhouse gases, and people like Aldona would know much more about that than me, but it's not a negligible amount. So it's good that there's modeling going on in that area. Myself, I've used the data to look at some oil spill risks, and of course there's a lot of modeling going on there with all the Transport Canada work and Clear Seas work, and a lot of other groups. But it's a very complex problem, whether it's looking specifically at oil spill drift models or where are the ships likely to go in the future as more of them go up north, and what about the receptors, working with NRCan, Environment Canada, thinking about where the sensitive areas are. So we did pieces of that work in conjunction with other researchers. Jackie Dawson at Ottawa U did a MEOPAR project, and it's involved with her many other projects along these lines, looking at Arctic shipping and where the trends. She's done a lot of work on cruise ship traffic, and then looking over decades using Nord-Drag data at how the shipping traffic is growing and changing over time. And so she's tying all that together through this MEOPAR project. Another risk from ships, of course, is invasive species, whether they stick to the hull or they get deposited into the waters through ballast water. And even though in theory, they're not dumping ballast water in the north by regulations, in any case, a ship traffic could bring some on the hull. And also, of course, you could have a shipping accident where the ship might end up releasing ballast water or sinking. So there's just a question of where are the ships, where are they coming from, what parts of the world are they coming from, and what other researchers have shown are the sources of different invasive species in different locations. And DFO's done a lot of work on this area, including with international groups. And so we added a little bit to the piece of that puzzle. In cycle 2 for MEOPAR that we're in the middle of, Rosalind Kness has another project looking at AIS data for smaller vessel movements, and that's working with exactEarth, where they're testing out some new devices and how you can track smaller vessels using smaller, lighter devices, and they're applying it to whale watching as a case study on the West Coast. As you can see, Jackie Dawson has another one focused on marine protected areas in the north. Here, Susan Allen, also on the West Coast at UBC, is looking at specifically the transport of dilbit and other oils, the risks that brings to the Salish Sea, which, as you can imagine, is a very highly investigated topic because of the pipeline developments on the West Coast. The next one is one that I'm doing a bit of work on cumulative risk assessment. Cumulative in the sense that most risk assessments from shipping focus on one topic, like air emissions or oil emissions or noise or whale collisions. And yet ships bring all of these risks with them. And although the remedies might be very different for the different risks, it might be interesting to some stakeholders, especially northern residents, what are the combined risks. So Transport Canada is also doing a big project on this now with some consultants, so I look forward to hearing more about that work. Another one is on shipping resilience, and if there's a major natural disaster on the coast, specifically the West Coast, but we're also looking at the East Coast. Let's say there's an earthquake and some ports or shipping traffic is disrupted. How do you respond to the emergency response phase? How do you move around fuel? How do you evacuate? How do you move food, water, medicine, with alternate routes, alternate uses of ships? So we need the AIS data for that. And then, as you can see, David Atkinson on the West Coast is looking at weather and marine conditions and how that applies to shipping in that region. And finally, Brad DeYoung at Memorial University is using this to initiate a project where there's only so much data you can collect on the oceans from fixed buoys or satellites, and there's a great desire to instrument more ships or vessels of opportunity that belong to industry to gather more data as they cross the ocean. So there's a much bigger data set available than just research ships and a light monitoring that goes on now. And so the first step there is, well, where are the vessels and what types are they and where are they going? And then that will help lead to instrumenting them more. So I know that was a very long list, but I really want you to get an idea of the breadth of the topics that we're taking on here, some of which can be reported more during our workshop, maybe through posters as well.
Ron, thanks very much for that list. I did just want to interject. I see you're actually at the end of your presentation, but we already have a couple of questions coming in. So
Sure.
great. Great. So Ron, if you're wrapped up now, I think we're going to do just another quick poll, and that'll be up on your screens momentarily. The community would like to know, what do you see as the biggest gap or risk in current shipping risk and modeling? So there's a couple of options there: lack of data, project-specific risk assessments, lack of multidisciplinary perspectives and input to risk assessments, potential adverse effects from risk mitigation measures, and then other, and you can please feel free to share that in the chat window. And while you're doing that, I'd like to say thanks to all the presenters, to Peter and Megan and Ron. That was a really informative overview of some different things going on in the world of marine shipping risk. So we'll just see the poll results coming in. And we're just going to let that run for a minute to make sure that everyone has a chance to respond. And thanks for attending today and sharing, your feedback on this, because the community of practice is going to use this information to plan things like the event on December 7th in Halifax, then the forum, and in building the community itself. Okay. Looks like the majority of people have responded there, so we're going to share the results. And thanks again. I see some comments coming in the chat. Great, and we're going to share the results in a moment here. Excellent. Yeah, so we can see that lack of multidisciplinary perspectives and input to risk assessments is coming through as a clear gap or risk or need, and then a variety of other answers. And again, thanks for sharing some comments in the chat as well. Great. So now as I said, we do have some questions coming in, and I'm going to go through them with the presenters. The first question is actually for Peter, and the question comes from Maya, and she's wondering, what are the limitations of satellite AIS versus land antennas, if any? So Peter, if you could take a moment to share your thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So Maya, thank you very much for the question. I think it is an interesting one. And the two systems, the land-based antenna and the satellite-based antennas, are essentially very complementary. So in terms of the limitations from satellite AIS, as vessels go into port, they tend to be very dense regions. And the AIS transmission protocol actually has the vessels dial down the transmission power and the frequency at which they send the messages. So from a satellite reception point of view, it gets very difficult to receive these messages from ships as they go into dense ports regions. And so that's where, combining the data sets is a lot of value. And so the land-based antennas have the advantage that as the vessels go into port, they're picking them up in real time. Ports generally have AIS receivers, both for the port operations and commercial antennas that are there collecting the data that we have access to. And so that data can then be brought together into one homogeneous data set. Equally so, the terrestrial receivers don't exist all over the world or in remote coastlines. So their disadvantages are limitation on range. And so I think the two data sets combined is really the powerful solution. Hope that addresses your question.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. And Maya, feel free to ask a follow-up if you have further questions on that. The next question comes from Daryl, and the question is Transport Canada and the CCG involved in this initiative? So I'll leave that open to any of the presenters.
I'm not sure what initiative, if that came in when I was talking about the work we're doing on cumulative effects, where Transport Canada is a big project. If that was the intent, the answer is that our work started before that work, and we did involve TC and CCG in some workshop, but we're looking at specific methodologies and how they would apply. If the question is, how about involvement in the Canadian Shipping Risk Forum, the Coast Guard's on our steering committee and Transport Canada are observers on our steering committee, and we've had 3 or 4 calls with our steering committee in the last year as we prepared our funding application to MEOPAR, and we're planning ahead for our future events. So they are both involved with this community of practice.
Excellent, Ron, and thanks, Daryl, for asking that. We have another question from Michael. It's another response for the poll. And he notes that there may be a lack of quality analysis or methodology for how exactly do we measure low probability events. And that's an interesting comment. And just looking at the timing, I think that's for the last poll, the biggest gap or risk. And we will be taking all these comments that are coming in the chat and in the questions, and the community practice will be taking that back to use that data to, in your feedback to organize events and define priorities. So thanks for adding that. We have one more question here from Eric. Are you aware of the AQUO EU project methodology to address, assess, and quantify the underwater noise from shipping impact on marine fauna? Would one of the presenters like to address that?
Well, it's Ron here, I can start. Personally, no, even though I'm aware of these other noise projects in MEOPAR, but I assume the noise researchers in MEOPAR know about that, or some of them do. And David Barkley at Dalhousie is one of those people that works with different underwater noise projects. And we're also involved with Defense Research Establishment that does a lot of underwater noise work. Maybe more relevant, though, is there's also a new network organized by Stan Matwin, particularly on shipping and noise, using AIS data, called Meridian. And that group is specialized, got a lot of government and academic and industry researchers involved, and MEOPAR links with them on certain events as well. So it's kind of like, there are networks of networks now, which is very helpful.
Great, thank you, Ron. Do any of the other presenters want to comment on that initiative? The AQUO EU project methodology? Oh, we actually have one more question come in from Patrick, and the question is, I was wondering what information went into the sensitivity layer that was introduced by Megan, and where did it come from? So Megan, if you want to address that.
Yeah, Patrick, thanks for the question. I didn't get into much detail on the sensitivity layer because that project's still underway. We're just wrapping it up at the moment. But what we use there is publicly available information and focusing specifically on biological information, physical information, and socioeconomic information. So biological, for example, would be different species that live in the area, seabirds, marine mammals, different types of fish, and like conservation areas. All of those different factors were considered. And then for physical, what type of shoreline is it? Is it rocky? Is it marshy? Is it eelgrass? What does the seabed look like? And from that, to be able to determine what are the potential impacts that and how sensitive are these areas to potential impacts. For example, a rocky coastline is less sensitive to oil than an eelgrass bed would be. And then in terms of socioeconomic, we looked at factors such as population density, the existence of a port, other uses in the area such as commercial fishing, tourism, parks and recreation, water intakes and other uses, and just to try and get a broad spectrum understanding of the different uses and by animals, people, to get a sense of what the impacts could be from shipping. And we've started with oil because that was one of the more available data sets, but we hope to be able to apply this same approach to other sources of marine impacts such as other types of pollutants perhaps, or wake wash, anchor scour, other factors like that. I hope that answered your question.
Great, thanks, Megan. I think at this point, I'll turn it back over to Ron, and he's going to have some closing remarks for us.
Great, thank you, Laura. So I'd like to again thank our speakers, Peter Dorcas and Megan Matheson, but I also want to thank Laura Avery for facilitating the discussion. Laura's the training manager at MEOPAR. Casey Hilliard, who's joined the call, and as I said, he's the shipping forum coordinator. And Cindy Marvin, who's also on the call, who runs the risk communication community of practice within MEOPAR, but also helps out with other communities of practice, including this one. So thanks to all those people. And I thanks all our audience. We have 50 people online, and that's a great start for our first webinar. I think the key thing is that the community of practice is about the people that are interested and participate in our webinars once or twice a year, and maybe our gatherings once a year. So we're really counting on you all to tell your colleagues more about this, and then they can sign up if they want, because that's the only way we have of getting hold of people and telling them more about our activities, and especially this upcoming workshop on December 2nd. So there, the bottom line is the email at Casey's Monitoring, and we'll also have a web page up and running fairly soon. So, and there's above it is the link to just join the community of practice automatically. So please stay in touch, and we thank you all for your attention.